So yeah, my name is Mark Driver. I'm an analyst with Gartner Research, which is either a good thing or a bad thing in this particular crowd, I believe. But I've covered open source for about 14 years, and over the course of that tenure, I've talked with 1,000 or more companies and several thousand adopters of open source and developers and vendors and so on and so forth. And I think what I'm going to provide for you today is, as opposed to a lot of the other speakers, is more of a higher level strategic view, the view from the guy in the blimp over the battlefield as opposed to the view of the guy in the trenches, and hopefully give you some additional insight there. I'm going to spend a short amount of time with you this morning, and then I have a session this afternoon. We'll go into more detail with some survey data and that kind of stuff. But really what I want to give you an impression of is kind of where we see open source and how it's changed over the last 10 years or so, and kind of the perspective, the expectation, and the reality of open source from the mainstream user, not the Silicon Valley startup, not the .com, mega companies that are out there, the Googles and the Facebooks and so on and so forth of the world, but really it's sort of the typical IT organization, the journeyman, mom and pop shop, the multinational, you name it, the government agency, those kind of organizations that are using open source around the world. What we've seen today is that, and we published this, so essentially with Gartner, depending on who you ask, we're either the armchair quarterbacks or we're the weathermen of the IT industry, right? We look for patterns and figuring out kind of where trends are happening and where they're going. And just like the weatherman, we can, with some accuracy, we can predict kind of where things are going, what things are doing. And just like the weatherman, we're not perfect and we're not 100% accurate in all occasions, but hopefully we do due diligence around what we're trying to do. And one of the things that we've been doing for the last 10 years is making predictions on kind of where open source is going and who's using it. And this is an update to research that we've been doing since the early 2000s when we started with very low numbers. And last year, the end of last year, we updated it and we finally hit effective virtual saturation, where we're essentially saying in the next short number of years, virtually everyone will have open source in their mission critical portfolios. Now, to many in this audience, you may be looking at it and saying, well, no duh, no kidding. But believe me, this is, when I present this to the average CIO of a shoe company or a lumber company or a retailing organization, they tend to go white. They say, what do you mean? We're not using any open source. I've lost count of the number of times the conversation I have with a client starts off with, the client says, yeah, we heard about this thing called open source and we're really not doing any open source today, but we're thinking about it. We're thinking that maybe we'll dig into it. And in every single case, I say, well, do me a favor, go off and do a simple audit, and let's reschedule this phone call for 2 weeks. And nearly 100% of the time, that same person comes back in 2 weeks and they go, yeah, we had no idea that Perl was open source. Who knew? It's been on our server for 200 years. We had no idea. We found 300 packages. And the scary part is 200 of those packages are used in mission critical applications. And we didn't even know they were there. This is another point of sort of the scary part, is that the good news is that open source is everywhere. The bad news is that open source is everywhere, and it's not always managed the way it should be. But basically we're saying, once again, and a lot of this isn't even coming from our organizations who are directly out there adopting and leveraging open source sort of knowingly. It's coming from their system integration vendors. It's coming from their consultants. It's coming from IBM. And goodness gracious, from Microsoft these days, from Oracle, and from many, many other vendors who are themselves embedding open source in their own supply chain because they're looking for the benefits. So we're seeing this quite a bit, once again, including cases where the organization isn't even aware of it. And I have to reiterate, it's oftentimes very, very surprising the amount of open source that's being used in an organization, and they're simply unaware of it. Certainly at the CIO level. The engineers, they know it's there. Right? And they kind of yeah, we know what's there. Right? They put it there, and they didn't necessarily tell management about it. Because they knew if they told management about it, they get a bunch of heartache and probably make life a lot harder. So one of the things that's certainly changing is the awareness of open source is becoming much more prevalent at higher levels in the enterprise. So I put together sort of this real simple, and if your favorite open source product isn't on here, I apologize because it gets real crowded real quick. But I was just kind of looking back at the history of open source. And to be fair, this chart should go back to the 60s. So something a lot of some of my colleagues that perhaps are significantly younger than some of us in the audience aren't aware of is that the notion of commercial software, or let's say the notion of shared software, predates the commercial software industry by a decade or more. It wasn't until IBM and Digital and most famously Microsoft and other vendors started really, quote unquote, selling software. Before that, computers were used by geeks, and geeks wrote software for one another, and geeks shared software across each other. So there really was no concept of a commercial software industry until about the late 70s and the early 80s. But the formal notions of quote-unquote open source, I think they're largely credited to RMS and the work that he did in the Free Software Foundation, starting with things like Emacs and eventually GCC, and the formation of the Open Source Initiative, and so on and so forth. And the thing that's interesting is every year that goes by, those dots get more and more crowded. More and more is happening every single year. So in terms of my perspective and where we started seeing open source in the minds of the mainstream adopter, it was largely unknown until the mid-90s or so. As we first started getting the questions of, you know, what is this thing called open source? Those were my first, certainly the first several hundred inquiries I ever did with clients was actually explaining, and there was a tremendous amount of confusion over freeware and shareware and open source. I remember sitting in front of an audience one time. It was I won't name the state, but it was a state government conference, and the entire audience was about this size, and the entire audience was software procurement officers, the people who do contract negotiations and deal with software contracts in various state agencies. And the first words out of my mouth was, open source is not public domain. And damn near half the audience passed out. Right? They just absolutely had panic attacks. What do you mean it's not public domain? You know, what do you mean this is licensed and I have to, you know, do certain restrictions and I have things that I have to do to comply to open source? There was a tremendous amount of confusion, and still is among some. I get people say, we have we're all going all open standards, so we're going to go all open source because we're open standards. And you scratch your head and go, well, they're really not the same thing. Or we have an open source and shareware policy. Well, once again, not really the same thing. So we get a lot of those kind of calls, and there was a lot of education going on. And you can see this is about the same time when you had Steve Ballmer calling Linux cancer, and other people at Microsoft, Bill Gates, and likening it to software communism and so on and so forth. This sort of reaction in the establishment against this new thing called open source. And then I started seeing the questions change a little differently. People come in and say, well, I kind of know what open source is, but it scares the hell out of me, so what do I do? How do I avoid it? How do I lock it out of my enterprise? What can I do to keep my engineers from doing the stuff that I don't want them to do? Vendors, I don't like the stuff called open source. What can we do to compete against it and to shut it down before it causes us problems? We got a lot of those questions. People tend to fear the unknown, right? So the first thing among many executives was, don't like it. Nope, 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 nope. Nope, I'm an IBM shop, I'm an Oracle shop, I'm an SAP shop, I'm a Microsoft shop. This doesn't fit in nice and cleanly here. So what do we do to shut it down? And that's still happening even today. But most of those inquiries are kind of dying away these days. The major perception is that among, once again, mainstream organizations, the more conservative organizations, has been that it has really shifted from a concept of a risk to a concept of an advantage. They're really looking at it in a different perspective today. The thing that really kind of changed the name of the game, right? 1997, the entire world went broke. And people were rushing to CIOs and CEOs were giving edicts. Either you reduce your IT budget by 15% or you lay off 20 people. It's as simple as that. You will reduce your budget. You will save money. So we saw a lot more emphasis from increasingly conservative users who were saying, let's give this thing a shot. I don't have any money. Somewhat paradoxically, and I don't know if I cover it this morning or maybe this afternoon. I'm getting the sign that we're already almost out of time here. So this afternoon, we'll talk about where open source is in certain markets and vendors. But the government sector is one of the paradoxes of open source. Government is one of the heaviest users of open source. Governments are also one of the most conservative users of technology in the world. They're very risk averse. You don't gamble with the public's money in many cases, and yet all governments are broke. So we see a tremendous drive from open source because of government, and that kind of led into other areas as well. These days, the major shift is, great, okay, how can I begin to leverage open source for long-term competitive advantage? Because quite frankly, just asking if you can save money on open source is really, in fact, short-sighted as well. There's a long list of motivating factors for using open source. There is an expectation of cost savings in virtually every scenario that I come across among mainstream users. And I can tell you very, very clearly that these people who are using open source are not always saving money. It's in fact surprisingly how oftentimes when I sit down with a client and I say, why are you using open source? Well, it's cheaper. We're using it because it's cheaper. And I say, great, let's crunch the numbers. We'll spend an hour, 2 hours, and they haven't managed to prove that they've saved any money with open source over 3 or 4 years. In many cases they did, they just can't prove it. In other cases, they find out, you know what, it really wasn't that much cheaper. But they're getting other value. They're getting value through flexibility. They're getting value through innovation, and so on and so forth. So the point I make to many users, particularly adopters long term, is you've got to look at sort of the big picture, the total ROI picture, not just whether or not this particular piece of open source is going to cost less to license or to download than something else. All right, I'm going to skip through here. We're going to cover most of this once again in this afternoon session. So what's going on today? The major attitude is shifting from the idea of open source as being a risk factor to being a positive reward. People are actively looking to open source over and above closed source systems. This has been something that many of you in the high-tech industry and early adopters have been doing for years, but now that's shifting to the right-hand side of the bell curve. We're seeing procurement processes being updated. One of the biggest problems in open source adoption up until recently is that the language in many of the procurement policies in many organizations inadvertently had a bias against open source. It was based on this idea of contracts and vendors and bids and so on and so forth. And I got a lot of people say, listen, we can't actually adopt open source without breaking our own rules, either in our government agency or in our company. And we're starting to see those things change. Probably most importantly, and I could spend an hour just on this concept, while open source has been playing, in many established markets, open source has been playing catch up. It's been trying to get as good, MySQL as good as Oracle and IBM, Linux as good as Unix, and so on and so forth. And open source has done a really good job of sort of reaching a good enough parity, a good enough threshold at a lower cost and greater flexibility. But now look at the markets that haven't been around for 30 years. Mobile, cloud, social, big data, in-memory computing, and the list goes on and on and on. In these markets, open source isn't 20 years behind the curve. The really fascinating thing is in many of these markets, it's open source technologies which are at the vanguard. They're actually pushing these new market categories. So when we look back 25 years from now, I think we'll look back and we'll say, the real killer app for open source wasn't this idea of coming in and doing it cheaper than something else. It was the ability of open source to leverage the idea of open innovation for new markets that largely created an entire new way of attaching IT. I mean, imagine Microsoft or IBM realistically coming out with a competitor to Android or to big data systems in this day. Once you get that, once you acquire that massive network effect, it kind of owns the space. And that's really the fascinating thing we see about open source for the next 20 years. And then finally, what I'll say here, once again, we'll get into a lot more detail on this in this afternoon if you're interested, is mainstream organizations are trying to establish governance programs, but not to leave you with a downer, most of those programs are ineffective today. There's a long way to go for most open source adopters to create a policy and a governance program that effectively allows them to both minimize the risk as well as maximize the rewards. And that really is what I deal with clients every single day. It's about, okay, great, how do you put in the rules, the processes in place to make sure that you're bringing in these assets that can be used to their best effect without creating some sort of time bomb that may or may not go off in 5 months or 5 years. So once again, thank you for your time this morning. I know it was real quick. If you're interested in this topic and the slides that I went through, that skipped through, and other information, I think it's at 2:30 or something. We're doing a whole session. Thanks.